The whiteboard by the shop door had 6 names written next to the word Arsorbirds, and the next batch of frames wasn't even off the assembly table yet. A contractor's truck idled in the gravel lot outside, waiting on a delivery that wouldn't be ready until Thursday. Julian Ash wiped his hands on a shop rag and checked the board again, the way he did a dozen times a day without really thinking about it anymore. 2 more calls had come in that morning, asking about the same batch, both from crews who hadn't managed to get their names on the list in time. None of it would have made sense to the people who'd laughed at him 2 years earlier, standing behind a packing shed full of old orchard ladders nobody wanted. Back then, the idea that contractors would someday be competing over a waiting list for anything built out of that pile would have sounded like a joke. The auction that started it all took place on a cold March morning at Hargrove Orchards, out along the flats east of Wenatchee, Washington. The Hargrove family had run the operation for 2 generations, and after switching over to a mechanized platform harvesting system the year before, they were clearing out decades of equipment that no longer fit how the orchard worked. Crates, pruning shears, old sprayers, irrigation fittings, and a battered flatbed cart all went up for bid that morning, drawing a modest but steady crowd of local growers and equipment buyers. Toward the end of the sale, the auctioneer, a lean man named Pruitt Sanderson, worked his way to a long row of orchard ladders leaning against the side of the packing shed. There were 60 of them, tall and narrow, built in the old tripod style that orchard crews had used for generations to work between tree rows, 3-legged and light enough for one person to carry. Most were faded silver aluminum, dented in places, a few with bent or missing rubber feet, 1 or 2 visibly twisted from years of hard orchard use. 60 is one lot, Pruitt announced, gesturing toward the row. Buyer hauls all of them. A few people in the crowd chuckled before he'd even opened the bidding. $450 for 60 ways to fall off a tree, one man near the front called out, and a ripple of laughter followed. Nobody picks apples like that anymore, someone else added. You opening a museum? A third voice chimed in, and that one got the biggest laugh of the morning. Pruitt opened at $700, and the price slid down from there with no takers, settling finally at $450. Julian stood near the back of the crowd, 20 years old, still wearing the flannel jacket he'd worn for 2 seasons of part-time orchard, work at a smaller operation nearby, work that had been drying up fast as more growers switched to platform systems like Hargrove's. He also picked up occasional painting jobs with a local contractor named Wes Doggett, mostly barns and outbuildings, and between the two he'd spent enough time on uneven ground and awkward angles to have opinions about ladders most people never thought twice about. He'd used the old tripod-style orchard ladders himself years earlier, and remembered how differently they handled compared to a standard extension ladder. Narrower, lighter, able to stand freely on soft or uneven ground without leaning against anything. Pruitt called the price one more time, sounding ready to let the whole lot go for nothing if nobody stepped up. Julian raised his hand. The laughter picked back up almost immediately. "Son, what are you going to do with 60 of those?" An older grower asked, twisting around to look at him. Julian didn't have a real answer yet, and he didn't pretend to. Nobody bid against him, and Pruitt brought the gavel down. $450, 60 ladders, buyer hauls everything. The chuckling followed him back toward his truck, the kind of good-natured mockery that farming country handed out freely whenever somebody did something that didn't make obvious sense. His mother, Denise, wasn't laughing when he told her that evening. $450 had been most of what he'd been setting aside toward a contractor's certification course he'd been planning to take that summer, money he'd earned slowly over 2 seasons of orchard work and side painting jobs. "You spent your certification money on ladders nobody wants anymore," Denise said, not quite believing it as she said it out loud. "I know how it sounds," Julian said. "Does it sound different to you?" she asked, and he didn't have a clean answer for that yet either. The real trouble started the next morning, when Julian realized that owning 60 long aluminum ladders and actually moving them were 2 very different problems. His own truck bed could handle maybe 8 at a time, strapped carefully with the overhang marked by a red flag the way the law required. He ended up borrowing a long flatbed trailer from Wes, making 4 separate trips over 2 days, loading and unloading ladders by hand, until his forearms ached in a way he hadn't expected from something so light. By the time the last load was stacked behind his family's detached garage, Julian understood something the crowd at the auction had clearly already known without saying it out loud. The $450 had been the easy part. Between the trailer rental fee Wes had quietly waived, the diesel for 4 round trips, and a set of new tie-down straps he'd had to buy, after one of the old ones frayed through, on the second load, Julian figured he'd already spent close to $200 just getting the ladders home. Denise noticed the fuel receipts stacking up on the kitchen counter before he'd said a word about them. "That's not the auction price anymore," she said, turning one of the receipts over in her hand. "That's real money going out the door for something sitting in the garage, doing nothing." Julian didn't have a good answer for her that night, and the silence between them lasted through most of dinner. The kind of quiet that wasn't angry so much as worried. His younger brother, Cameron, thought the whole thing was funny for about a week, until he needed to park his bike somewhere and found half the garage taken up by aluminum ladders instead. His first plan seemed sensible enough at the time. He would clean the ladders up, straighten what needed straightening, replace the worst of the rubber feet, and resell them as used orchard equipment, the same purpose they'd always served. He spent a couple of weeks on it, working evenings in the garage, scrubbing years of orchard grime off the aluminum, tightening loose rivets, swapping out cracked feet for new rubber caps he bought in bulk from a hardware supplier. He picked his best dozen, posted them for sale, and waited. Interest was almost non-existent. Most nearby orchards had already made the same switch Hargrove had, moving toward platform harvesting and modern safety standards that didn't favor a decades-old tripod design. The handful of most growers still using ladder harvesting only needed 1 or 2 replacements at most, not a dozen at a time from a stranger. One buyer who did purchase a repaired ladder brought it back a week later, complaining that it felt unstable on the hard concrete floor of his equipment barn, wobbling in a way it apparently hadn't on the orchard's softer ground. Julian refunded him without much argument, since he didn't have a good answer for the complaint himself. By the end of that first month, he'd sold exactly 3 ladders and had 57 left, along with the growing sense that the entire plan had been built on a market that simply didn't exist anymore. He sat on an overturned bucket in the garage one evening, looking at the stacked pile, seriously considering hauling the whole thing to a scrapyard just to be done with it. The idea that changed everything came a few weeks later, almost by accident, on a job with Wes Doggett. They were repainting the exterior of an old barn on a property with badly uneven ground, the kind of lumpy, root-riddled soil that made a standard extension ladder a hazard to even set up properly. Wes had brought sawhorses and planks to try to level out a working platform along one stretch of wall, but the setup kept shifting on the uneven dirt, forcing them to stop and readjust every few minutes. Julian remembered the ladders sitting back at the garage and grabbed one from the truck, almost as an afterthought, figuring the wide tripod stance might handle the rough ground better than the sawhorses had. It did, settling into the uneven soil without rocking the way the sawhorse setup had, its 3 legs finding their own footing independently, instead of needing a level surface underneath. Wes noticed it too, standing back and studying the ladder for a moment longer than the job really required. "That thing sits steadier than my sawhorses did," Wes said, sounding almost annoyed about it. Julian looked at the ladder differently after that, not as a tool for climbing anymore, but as a shape that solved a problem neither of them had been thinking about directly. The triangular footprint didn't need a wall to lean against, didn't need level ground the way a plank and sawhorse setup did, and weighed next to nothing compared to anything else that offered similar stability. Standing there in the barn's shadow, Julian understood that the market for old orchard ladders had disappeared, but the shape underneath the ladder, the light, wide, self-standing tripod frame hadn't disappeared at all. Nobody needed a specialty harvesting ladder anymore, but plenty of people needed something stable, light, and easy to move around on ground that wasn't flat. He stopped asking himself how to sell old ladders and started asking a different question entirely. What could the frame itself become if it stopped trying to be a ladder at all? Over the following weeks, Julian worked through a rough prototype using 2 of the better frames from the pile, cutting away the worn upper steps that no longer served any purpose, reinforcing the main tripod junction where the legs met, and building a small removable platform deck that could rest low across a modified crossbar between two frames. He kept the working height deliberately low, nothing close to what a real ladder would reach, since the whole point was ground-level stability rather than elevation. He added wider adjustable feet in place of the old rubber caps, designed to grip better on both soft dirt and hard concrete, and rigged a simple pin and bracket system so the crossbar and deck could be assembled and taken apart quickly on site. The first version looked rough, mismatched paint and all, but it stood on its own, low and steady. Exactly the kind of support Wes had needed weeks earlier without either of them realizing what to call it. He brought it back to Wes for a real test on the next uneven ground job. It held up better than the sawhorses had, but it wasn't perfect. The platform deck flexed slightly under Wes's full weight when he shifted his stance, and the crossbar connection loosened after repeated setup and breakdown, requiring constant retightening. "Good idea," Wes said, tapping the deck with his boot, "but I wouldn't trust my full weight on this every day without it flexing less than that." Julian took the feedback seriously instead of getting defensive about it, spending the next month refining the connection system, adding a locking pin instead of a simple bolt, widening the crossbar to reduce flex, and standardizing exactly where each component attached so setup didn't require guesswork every time. He brought the improved version out to a small greenhouse repair job Wes had picked up, eager to prove the flex problem was solved. It wasn't, not entirely. The wider crossbar helped, but one of the two frames sat slightly higher than the other on the greenhouse's uneven concrete pad, leaving the platform deck tilted just enough that Wes refused to stand on it, fully loaded with tools. "I'm not testing your theory with a busted ankle," Wes said, setting his paint bucket down instead of climbing up. Julian took the frame home that same evening and traced the problem to the adjustable feet themselves, which turned out to thread unevenly under load, letting one side settle lower than the other over time. He redesigned the foot assembly with a locking collar that held its position once tightened, tested it himself on the same uneven concrete the following week, and brought it back to Wes a second time. This time, the platform sat level under his full weight, tools and all, without the telltale tilt from before. The second version held steadier, assembled faster, and stopped loosening after repeated use. Wes bought 3 units outright once the second version proved itself, using them regularly on jobs with uneven or awkward ground, where sawhorses and standard ladders had always been more trouble than they were worth. A greenhouse maintenance crew heard about it through Wes and came by to look at a unit for themselves, since narrow greenhouse aisles created exactly the kind of tight, awkward footing the frames handled well. They bought 4 after testing one for a week, impressed by how easily a single worker could carry and reposition a frame compared to hauling scaffolding through cramped rows of plants. Not long after, a barn repair contractor named Frank Ludlow called after hearing about the frames from Wes at a hardware store counter, curious whether they'd hold up on the kind of sloped, rutted ground he dealt with fixing siding on old dairy barns. Julian drove one of the field frames out to a job site himself and setting it up along a barn wall that sat on a slope steep enough that Frank's usual ladder needed to be chocked with wood blocks just to sit level. The tripod feet found their own footing on the slope without any blocking at all, and Frank spent the better part of an hour testing it from different angles before he said much of anything. "I've been fighting that slope for 15 years, Frank said, finally setting his hammer down. He ordered 5 field frames on the spot, becoming the 3rd steady customer inside of 2 months, and mentioned Julian's name to a couple of other barn contractors he knew from around the valley. By the end of that first year, Julian had settled into 2 standardized models built off the same basic tripod geometry, a compact frame sized for greenhouse aisles and tight indoor spaces, and a slightly wider field frame meant for outdoor barn and building maintenance work where uneven ground was the main problem. Both used identical locking points, identical crossbar spacing, and identical adjustable feet, so parts were interchangeable, regardless of which frame they came from originally. He'd sold roughly 20 units by then, still a small operation working out of the family garage, but steady enough that the original panic about the certification money had faded into something closer to cautious optimism. Going into the second year, Julian brought in a retired contractor named Otis Fairweather to look over his process, a cautious, safety-minded man who'd spent 30 years doing barn and agricultural building work before retiring and picking up occasional consulting for smaller outfits around the valley. Frank Ludlow was the one who'd suggested it, mentioning almost in passing that Otis had once refused to let his own crew use a batch of scaffolding he didn't trust, even though it meant delaying a job for a week. Julian called him mostly out of curiosity, half expecting to be told his whole idea was reckless. Otis walked through the shop slowly, picking up finished frames, flexing the joints, checking the welds Julian had added at the reinforced junctions. "Lightweight isn't the same as safe," Otis said, setting a frame back down with more care than the comments suggested. He pointed out hairline stress marks near one of the older leg joints that Julian had missed entirely, evidence of metal fatigue built up over decades of orchard use that wouldn't necessarily show up as an obvious crack. "Not every one of these old frames is good stock," Otis said. "Some of them have already given most of what they've got." Julian took the warning seriously, and Otis agreed to keep advising him periodically as the business grew, mostly out of what seemed like genuine interest in seeing a young guy do the work carefully instead of cutting corners. Otis never took payment for those early visits, waving off the offer each time, saying only that he'd rather spend an afternoon in a shop than sitting around his own place with nothing to fix. Demand kept building through that second year, mostly through word passed between contractors who'd used Wes's frames or seen the greenhouse crew's setup and asked around about where they'd come from. A couple of small orders came in from towns Julian had never even sold to before, one from a sign installation crew 2 counties north, who'd heard about the frames through a hardware store clerk, another from a landscape company doing seasonal cleanup work along the river bottoms where standard ladders sank straight into the soft ground. Julian started keeping a running list of good frames on hand versus frames still waiting on inspection, and for the first time since the auction, he found himself turning down small requests simply because he didn't have enough finished units ready to fill them. That scarcity felt uncomfortable at first, the opposite of everything he'd worried about when the garage was still full of unsold ladders that first year. By late summer, Julian had more orders than his remaining stock of good frames could comfortably supply, and a larger seasonal job created the kind of pressure Otis had warned him about from the start. A landscape maintenance company preparing for a big contract needed 10 field frames on a tight 2-week deadline, more than double any single order Julian had filled before. He counted his good stock and came up 6 short, with the rest of his remaining pile made up of frames he'd already set aside as questionable, a couple with visible surface cracking near the leg joints, one with a leg that had been bent and straightened so many times over its life that the metal had likely thinned from the repeated stress. He told himself reinforcement welds would compensate for whatever weakness was hiding underneath, the same way he'd told himself the auction price alone made the whole pile worth buying in the first place. The deadline felt too close, and the order felt too important to turn away, so he processed the 6 questionable frames into finished units, reinforced as best he knew how, and shipped the full order on schedule. 4 days later, Wes called him, and his voice carried none of its usual easy tone. One of the frames had twisted and partially collapsed while a worker was setting up along a low retaining wall, dropping the low platform deck a short distance before the worker managed to step clear. Nobody was seriously hurt, a bruised shin and a scare more than anything, but the job stopped cold while the crew inspected every remaining unit out of caution, and the landscape company's foreman made it clear he wasn't interested in continuing the contract until Julian could prove it wouldn't happen again. Julian drove out that same afternoon to look at the failed unit himself, and the break told him everything he needed to know before he even asked a single question. The leg had failed exactly where a hairline crack, invisible unless you knew to look for it, had finally given way under normal working load, the same kind of fatigue Otis had warned him about weeks earlier standing in his own shop. He had known that particular frame was borderline when he processed it, and he had used it anyway because the deadline mattered more in that moment than the standard he'd been claiming to follow. That was on him, and he didn't try to explain it any other way to the foreman standing in front of him with a cracked frame between them. He recalled the entire batch, replacing every one of the 10 units at his own cost, refunding the portion of the order tied to the frame that had failed, and paying out of pocket for a section of decking the crew had damaged during the incident. That same week, he called his insurance agent to ask about coverage, only to learn that his existing policy hadn't been written with a manufactured product in mind at all, just general liability for a small fabrication shop. The agent wasn't unkind about it, but he was direct. You can't keep selling something like this without a policy that actually covers a product failure, he told Julian. Right now you're exposed, and so is anyone using what you've built. Julian made the decision himself, without anyone forcing his hand, to pause all sales until he had proper coverage in place and had personally gone back through every unit he'd already sold. Over the following 2 weeks, he drove out to Wes's shop, the greenhouse crew's facility, and Frank Ludlow's barn sites, inspecting every frame already in the field for the same kind of hairline cracking that had caused the failure. None of the earlier units showed the same problem, which was some relief, but it cost him most of a month of income he didn't have much cushion to spare. The landscape company didn't place another order for the rest of that season, and word of the failure moved through the same network of contractors who'd been steadily building his reputation up until that point. A couple of prospective buyers who'd been ready to place their first orders decided to wait and see how things settled before committing. For a stretch of weeks that fall, Julian came closer to shutting the whole thing down than at any point since the auction. Sitting with the failure instead of running from it forced him toward the lesson that mattered most. The triangular geometry, the lightweight, the portability, none of that had been the problem, and none of it had changed. What had changed was that he'd let urgency override a standard he already knew mattered. Using material he'd privately flagged as questionable, because turning down the order felt worse in the moment than the risk of using it did. Metal Fatigue didn't care how clever the underlying idea was, and it didn't care how badly he needed the sale. The business could only stay standardized on the output side if it became just as standardized and just as strict on the input side. He built a formal acceptance standard over the following weeks, working through it with Otis's guidance rather than guessing on his own the way he had before. Every incoming ladder frame now got inspected for visible cracks, particularly around the leg joints and rivet zones where stress concentrated most. Badly bent rails, severe corrosion, and any frame that had clearly been straightened and rebent multiple times over its working life got set aside for scrap without exception, regardless of how badly a particular order needed the tonnage. He started inspecting suspect joints under a bright work light, checking rivet holes and stress points for the fine hairline cracking that hid easily in shadow, and on anything still uncertain he used a dye-penetrant kit Otis had shown him, a simple spray-on solution that made hidden surface cracks show up in a way the naked eye alone would miss. Anything he couldn't confirm as sound got rejected without exception, regardless of how badly a particular order needed the tonnage. Frames that passed went into production, and frames that didn't went into a growing reject pile off to the side of the shop. A visible reminder that not everything from the original 60, or from any batch since, was actually worth converting. Alongside the new inspection standard, Julian built a proper assembly jig, something Otis had been quietly suggesting since his first visit to the garage. Instead of measuring and positioning each crossbar and locking bracket by hand every time, he built a steel table that held each frame at a fixed angle, with marked positions for the crossbar, the locking bracket, and the adjustable feet. Every finished frame came off that table with the same geometry as the last one, interchangeable down to the bolt pattern, instead of carrying whatever small variations had crept in when he'd been eyeballing measurements by feel. Production got faster and more consistent almost immediately, and just as important, every finished batch now went through a repeatable check before it left the shop, a visual inspection, a stability test on both hard and uneven surfaces, and a load test with sample units pushed and leaned on well past normal working weight before anything shipped. Rebuilding trust took longer than rebuilding the process had. Julian went back to the landscape company's foreman that winter, not asking for a new order, just showing him the acceptance standard, the jig and the load testing routine now built into every batch. The foreman listened with his arms crossed, clearly still cautious. "Should have had all this from the start," he said. "I should have," Julian answered, and didn't try to argue his way around it. It took most of a year before that company placed another order, but when they finally did, it was larger than the first. And the foreman mentioned the load testing routine specifically as the reason he'd decided to give it another try. By the third year, Julian's shop looked almost nothing like the cramped family garage where the whole thing had started. He'd moved into a small rented workshop on the edge of town, with 2 part-time workers helping cut, assemble, and inspect frames during the busiest stretches of the season. Multiple supply sources kept material flowing in, other orchards modernizing their harvesting systems the way Hargrove had, a greenhouse operation clearing out an old ladder inventory, and an equipment recycler, 2 counties over who now called Julian directly whenever old tripod-style ladders came through instead of sending them straight to scrap. He'd learned, lot by lot, which sources tended to hold up under inspection and which tended to be mostly fatigue and corrosion dressed up in decent-looking paint. A batch from a smaller orchard that had switched over just 2 seasons earlier passed inspection almost entirely, since the frames had barely been used before the operation upgraded. A batch bought cheap from a liquidated greenhouse supplier, on the other hand, lost more than half its frames to the reject pile. Old enough and worked hard enough that Julian walked away from buying that particular seller's remaining inventory rather than take a chance on volume he couldn't trust. That kind of selectivity had cost him some cheap material early on, back when he still needed every frame he could get, but by the third year it had become second nature. The same instinct Otis had been trying to teach him from that very first visit to the garage. Not every incoming frame passed inspection, and the reject pile stayed a permanent fixture behind the shop, evidence that the standard mattered more than the volume. During a strong production week, the shop and its 2 workers could finish somewhere around 15 to 20 units, cutting, welding, and testing off the same jig that had replaced Julian's earlier guesswork. Revenue that third year settled somewhere over $300,000, built almost entirely on unit sales of the 2 standardized frame models, with a smaller share coming from replacement decks and connector hardware, sold to customers expanding their existing sets. Julian tracked the difference between that number and what he actually kept just as carefully as he tracked incoming material, since acquisition costs, transport, aluminum and steel hardware, shop rent, insurance, testing, and labor for his 2 workers all came out of that figure before anything counted as profit. What was left over was modest compared to the total revenue, but it was steady and it had been earned the hard way, 1 inspected frame at a time. More than once that fall, 2 contractors called on the same afternoon asking about the same upcoming batch, and Julian had gotten used to the slightly awkward conversation that followed, explaining that the units were already spoken for and the next batch wouldn't be ready for another 2 weeks. One barn contractor, annoyed after losing out on a batch to a greenhouse crew who'd called an hour earlier, offered to pay extra just to jump the list. Julian turned him down, the same way he'd turned down rushed orders since the failure, and told him the earliest he could promise anything was the following batch: first come, first served, same as everyone else. The contractor grumbled about it, but he stayed on the list anyway, since by then there wasn't really anywhere else in the valley to get what Julian was building. One afternoon that fall, a familiar truck pulled into the lot, and Julian recognized the driver before the man had even climbed down. It was the same older grower who'd asked what he planned to do with 60 ladders back at the Hargrove auction 2 years earlier, a man named Cornelius Trask, who ran a smaller orchard operation on the far side of the valley and was in the middle of upgrading his own equipment shed. Cornelius walked slowly along the rows of finished frames stacked outside the shop, reading the model tags stenciled on the end of each row, most of them already marked with a customer's name. "Got any of those short frames left?" Cornelius asked, not quite meeting Julian's eyes. "Next 6 are already tagged," Julian said, checking the board. "Put me down for the batch after that," Cornelius said. Julian wrote his name on the whiteboard without comment, and Cornelius nodded once before heading back to his truck. Neither of them brought up the auction, and neither needed to. At home, the changes were smaller but steady, the way they always seemed to be with things built this slowly. Denise stopped bringing up the certification money, since Julian had long since replaced it, finished the course that spring, and put the paperwork up on the refrigerator without much fanfare. The family truck got new brakes and a long overdue timing belt that summer, no longer something Denise had to worry about every time she drove it into town. Julian bought his own small welding setup that fall, separate from the shop equipment, mostly so he'd never again have to depend entirely on borrowed tools the way he had that first difficult year. Cameron, old enough by then to help out on weekends, had traded his early complaints about the crowded garage for a part-time job, sweeping the shop floor and organizing hardware bins, proud in the offhand way. Younger brothers usually were about something they'd never admit mattered to them. None of it happened all at once, and none of it made the family wealthy, but the tight financial pressure that used to sit over every season eased into something closer to steady, ordinary footing. Behind the shop that evening, the last order of the week rolled out on a contractor's flatbed, frames stacked and strapped the way Julian had learned to stack them after that first brutal weekend hauling ladders out of the Hargrove packing shed. The reject pile sat where it always sat, cracked and fatigued frames waiting for the scrap buyer's next visit, a quiet reminder that not everything from that original lot or from any lot since had been worth saving. But the tagged rows stretching along the fence line told the rest of the story. Compact frames and field frames alike, built out of 60 obsolete orchard ladders that an entire valley had once assumed were headed straight for the scrap heap.